Okay. We are pretty much ready. I'm here with Ola, and I have to get my angle right here. And this is David. I just met you personally, but I've been looking at your face all week, brochures, books, stuff. And David has developed, as I understand it, a very effective program for trauma release.
Right.
There will be descriptions and books about it along the way. But I think it's important for you first to tell us a little about you, and then how you see trauma release generally in relation to your technique, how much you choose, and also what trauma is for you. Any order you like.
Okay, let me start by identifying trauma, because I think it's very much misunderstood in most of our cultures.
Right.
We somehow think that trauma is some huge experience that we have if we're in war or if we're in a terrible car accident or something like that. And yes, that can be traumatizing, meaning it's overwhelming for the individual. They don't know how to process or integrate that experience into their lives, and so it stays in some way compartmentalized for them as some extraordinary experience that can't seem to integrate into the rest of their lives. That's true, and that's called a hard trauma. But there's also what we call soft trauma. Soft trauma could be growing up in an alcoholic family, as an example, where even if you're not abused by the parent, you grow up in a state of fear. And so you perpetually learn to live in a state of alertness and carefulness. And that's considered trauma too, because it's living outside of your normal, ordinary state. So any situation that causes you to use extraordinary psychological and emotional abilities to survive that situation is considered trauma. That could be very natural from even early childhood on simple things. And here's an example. I had a client of mine who came in one time and had a lot of shoulder issues coming up in his therapy session. But he had no idea what they were coming from. And as we went through some of the exercises and he started feeling some release here, he remembered a time when his father, who used to swing him by his arm, actually one time accidentally pulled his arm out of the socket. Now that was obviously a trauma for the child. He was 3 years old. He didn't remember it. That was a traumatic event, but it even happened in the space of love. The father cared for this child. They were playing, but it was still a traumatizing event for the body. So trauma could be anything from something as simple as falling down and knocking your 2 front teeth out to being in war and having living through a hurricane or a tornado. So trauma is very pervasive. On the planet it's pervasive, and it's very hard for anybody to actually live on the planet without having experienced some degree of a traumatic event in their lives. Okay?
I also, now that you say this, it makes me think of the time when I worked with torture victims, and the doctor says to me, well, the victim, actually, that's tough. We can get that. We can fix it. We're talking about somatic reactions. We don't understand why the wives have these diffuse aches and pain. Beside the fact that often in Muslim cultures, if the woman's been raped, she can't talk about it.
Right.
Or as one very wise Muslim woman said to me from Iraq, the men fight Saddam and we pay the price. She had to hide in a bathroom with 7 children and hope nobody found her. I began to introduce the term, which fits with what you're saying, called war witnesses.
Well, there's something that's called vicarious trauma, and that's trauma where it's actually not happening to you. Like she's hiding in the bathroom with her children, and maybe nothing actually happened, but she's being traumatized by the potential that something will happen, and it's usually a life or death threatening situation. But oftentimes it's very well known sociologically that after war in a country, there's a huge rise in domestic violence and usually sexual abuse. And it's because after a war is over, although you've taken away the enemy, you haven't taken away the aggressive behavior that's in the individual around the enemy. And so the easiest thing to do is actually turn that aggressive behavior towards your spouse or your family or your children. And this happens quite commonly, actually. It's no different than you having a hard day at work and you come home and you yell at your wife over something simple which you know had nothing to do with her. It's just because you're still upset about something you experienced at work that was distressing you. And so that's displacing your anger. Well, if you do that for 10 years, you're living in war, and you've displaced 10 years of anger because you've now gotten rid of the enemy, but you still have violence inside yourself. It gets displaced into the culture. So it's very common to have a lot of residual effects from war types of traumas, and women suffer a great deal from it. I'm working with American soldiers in the United States who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
It's very clear they have trauma. They have post-trauma symptoms. They can tell you the memories they have in Iraq. However, the mother living at home with the 2 children lives every single day for fear that when that phone rings, it's going to be the military that's going to tell her husband's dead. When she hears the car door outside slam shut, she don't know if that's the military coming to tell her that her husband died. So she lives in perpetual fear every day that her husband may be killed. Now that's considered trauma too, but it's a soft trauma. Nothing ever really happened, but she lived at the threat of life and death for a year while her husband wasn't there. So the women are traumatized as much as the men are, but in different ways.
You know, there are 2 things I think about. One is you're talking about the person that had the hard day at work. And if you define positive stress as enthusiasm, you know, you can have to do 1,000 things that you're looking forward to. That's healthy.
Right.
Negative stress is non-empowerment. I'm powerless.
Right. Negative stress actually begins to shut down the systems in the body, whereas positive stress actually enhances the energy in the body and this creativity. And so when you're talking about negative stress, you're actually talking about a collapse in the system.
And that's why it's often said that when you're stressed, at least in business they say, every time you're stressed, you notice that everybody in the world is a jerk.
Right, exactly. It's sort of the prism that you begin to see life through. So that's what happened. This is how I came up with trying to figure out how to resolve this type of traumatic event that people have in their lives.